The trauma bay at Ironcrest Regional Hospital went dead quiet. 29-year-old Madison Hale, still in her scrubs, leaned over the gurney and looked at the patient's arm. The veins weren't just darkening. They were collapsing in a pattern she'd seen once before, in a place she was never supposed to talk about. She straightened up and said 3 words to the room. "This is Varick 7. The bioterror investigator standing 6 feet away stopped breathing. Because Varick 7 didn't exist in any civilian database on the planet, it had been developed in a black site laboratory, field-tested in one classified overseas operation, and then supposedly destroyed. Only Delta Force medical units had ever seen what it did to a human body. Madison had seen it, and now it was here, in a hospital in Ravenport, inside a man no one could identify, spreading through his bloodstream like ink dropped in water. Before she could say another word, Chief Physician Leonard Graves stepped in front of her and told her to get out. If you love stories about quiet strength, justice, and the kind of comeback nobody sees coming, follow my channel all the way to the end of this story. Hit like, and drop the name of the city you're watching from right now. I want to know how far this story has traveled across the world. The patient had come in through the ambulance bay at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, which was already the worst kind of shift. Short-staffed, post-weekend backlog clogging every bed, and a vending machine on the 3rd floor that kept eating dollar bills. Madison had been on her feet for 9 hours when the paramedics rolled him in, a man in his 50s with no ID, no phone, no wallet, wearing a gray maintenance uniform with the name tag torn off. His vitals were wrong in a way that didn't fit any standard pattern. Blood pressure dropping, but pulse staying elevated. Pupils uneven. Skin at the forearm mottled in that specific branching discoloration, not bruising, not necrosis, something else entirely. Spreading upward from the wrist toward the elbow at a pace that made Madison stop mid-step when she caught sight of it under the fluorescent lights. She'd been handing off a chart to Dominic Reyes, the 3rd-year resident who always looked mildly panicked, regardless of what was happening, and she just stopped. Put the chart down on the counter, walked to the gurney. "What's his GCS?" she asked the paramedic. 12 when we picked him up. Dropped to 10 on the way here. He was lucid for about 90 seconds and kept saying something about the water. We figured altered mental status from whatever's going on with... Did he say which water? Tap? Bottled? Municipal? The paramedic looked at her like she'd asked something insane. Lady, he was barely coherent. Madison wasn't listening anymore. She had the man's arm in her gloved hands, and she was examining the pattern at the inner forearm, the way the discoloration branched. Not randomly, not the way a contaminant or an allergic response would, but in a deliberate geometric spread that followed the venous structure like it had been engineered to do exactly that. Her mouth went dry. She let go of the arm carefully and took 1 step back. Looked at the patient's face, the slack jaw, the asymmetric pupil dilation, the thin line of bloody saliva at the corner of his mouth. Then she looked at the paramedic. "You need to bag everything you used on transport, every surface he touched in that ambulance. Don't go back in without respiratory protection." She turned to the charge nurse behind the desk. "I need this bay isolated, now." Madison isolated. "Right now, Karen. Full barrier." Karen Solis had worked Ironcrest ER for 16 years, and she knew how to read the difference between a nurse who was being dramatic and a nurse who'd seen something real. She picked up the phone. It was Dominic who asked the obvious question, because Dominic always asked the obvious questions at the wrong moment. "What is it? What do you think he has?" Madison hesitated for exactly 1 second, because saying it out loud meant committing to it, and committing to it meant everything that came after. "Varick 7, she said quietly. The bioterror investigator was there because Ironcrest had a federal liaison program. 2 investigators on rotating call rotation for exactly the kind of situation that almost never actually came up. His name was Agent Curtis Vane, and he was standing near the nursing station reviewing something on his tablet when Madison said those 2 words. He went still, not the stillness of someone who didn't understand, the stillness of someone who understood completely. He walked to the bay, looked at the patient, looked at Madison. "What did you just say?" "You heard me. That substance is not in any civilian. I know what it's not in." She met his eyes. "I know what it is." And I know what happens to him in the next 4 to 6 hours if we treat this like a standard toxic exposure. Vane stared at her. His expression had changed into something she couldn't fully read. A combination of disbelief and a particular wariness that Madison recognized as the face of someone recalculating everything they thought they knew about a situation. Before he could respond, the door to the trauma bay opened and Dr. Leonard Graves walked in. Graves was 61 years old, chief physician at Ironcrest for the past 11 years, a man who had the particular brand of confidence that came not from competence but from never having been seriously challenged. He was tall, silver-haired, and wearing the kind of expression that people in charge wore when they felt their authority had been disturbed without their permission. He looked at the isolated bay, looked at Vane, looked at Madison. "What's the situation?" "Patient presented with," Madison started. "I was asking Dr. Reyes." Dominic, to his credit, looked uncomfortable. The patient has an unusual presentation. Nurse Hale identified a possible—" "Nurse Hale." Graves said it the way someone might say that word when they were choosing not to say the actual thing they were thinking. He turned to Madison directly. "You called for an isolation bay." "Yes." Based on what assessment?" "Based on what I'm seeing in this patient's venous." "You're a staff nurse." He said it without particular cruelty, which somehow made it worse. Matter of fact, like he was clarifying something obvious. "Differential diagnosis is not within your scope of practice. If you had a concern, the appropriate step was to bring it to the attending. The attending wasn't in the bay when the patient arrived." "I'm here now." "Then look at his arm." Madison kept her voice level. This was not the moment. She knew it wasn't the moment. "Look at the branching pattern at the inner forearm. That's not a standard toxic response. That's specific morphology." "I can see the patient's arm, thank you." Graves moved past her, glanced at the man on the gurney with the distracted efficiency of someone who'd decided the answer before looking at the question. "This looks like a severe allergic response, possibly anaphylaxis with secondary vascular." "It's not anaphylaxis." The room got quiet. Graves turned around slowly. There was something in his expression now that wasn't just dismissal. It was something harder. "Excuse me?" Madison knew she should stop. She could feel Dominic's discomfort from across the room. Karen had set down the phone. Vane was watching without moving. "Anaphylaxis doesn't present with unilateral pupil dilation, and it doesn't cause that branching pattern at the venous junctions," she said. "The progression rate doesn't match any standard allergen response. The vascular involvement is too specific, too organized." "Are you telling me how to do my job?" "I'm telling you what I'm seeing in this patient." Graves looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Vane. "Is this woman actually a federal liaison, or did she just happen to be standing near one?" Vane said nothing, which wasn't a defense, but it wasn't an abandonment either. Graves turned back to Madison. When he spoke again, his voice was very quiet and very controlled. "You are a staff nurse. You do not call for isolation bays without physician authorization. You do not contradict attending physicians in front of patients and other staff. You do not—" He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something almost amused. "Identify classified toxins. There are protocols for a reason. Those protocols exist because the medical hierarchy exists for a reason. You are not a physician. You're not an investigator. You're not whatever you apparently think you are right now." He turned away from her, started issuing orders to Dominic about treatment protocol for severe anaphylaxis. Madison stood there. She looked at the patient on the gurney. The man was deteriorating in real time. She could see it in the quality of his breathing, in the way the discoloration had moved another 2 centimeters up his forearm in the past 6 minutes. She looked at Vane, who met her eyes briefly and then looked away. She picked up a pair of gloves from the dispenser, pulled them on, and walked back to the gurney. "I need you to step back, Nurse Hale. I'm documenting the current vascular presentation." "I said step back." She documented it anyway, made a manual notation in the bedside log because she didn't trust that the electronic record wouldn't get altered later. Date, time, description of the branching pattern, measurement of spread, estimated progression rate. She wrote it in clear, specific clinical language, and she signed her name to it. Then she stepped back. Graves watched her with an expression that had moved past irritation into something colder. He waited until she was fully clear of the gurney. You're done for tonight, he said. Go to the charge station and wait there. I'll deal with this in a moment. There's an emergency response meeting at... You will not be attending. The patient made a sound then. Not a word, not coherent, just a low involuntary noise from somewhere in his chest that meant his body was doing something it couldn't control anymore. Madison heard it. Graves heard it. Everyone in the room heard it. Graves turned back to the gurney and started talking over him. Madison walked out of the trauma bay. She stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the noise of the ER around her, the monitors, the distant PA system, the particular ambient hum of a hospital at midnight. And she thought about the patient's veins, about the way the pattern had looked, about the last time she'd seen it. She pulled out her personal phone and typed a text to a number she hadn't used in over 2 years. Ravenport, Ironcrest Regional. Male patient, unknown identity, progressive vascular necrosis pattern consistent with V7. Presenting alone. Need to know if there are others. She sent it, put the phone in her pocket. Then she went and stood at the charge station and waited, like she'd been told. The emergency response meeting happened at 1 a.m. in the administrative conference room on the 4th floor. Madison knew about it because Karen told her, not to invite her, but because Karen thought she should know what was being said about her. Graves had convened it. 6 physicians, 2 hospital administrators, Agent Vane, and 2 other federal officials whose names and titles Karen didn't catch. The topic, officially, was the unidentified patient in Bay 4 and an incident involving a nursing staff member. Madison was not invited. She was, technically, still on shift, still in the building, but she had been administratively sidelined, taken off patient assignments, her access card flagged pending review, told to remain available. She sat in the break room and drank bad coffee and waited. At 2:15 a.m., Dominic found her. He looked worse than his usual, panicked. He sat down across from her and for a moment just looked at the table. He's dying, Dominic said finally. The patient. They went with the anaphylaxis protocol, and he's not responding, and his vascular involvement has spread to his shoulder, and He stopped. They're calling it a mystery presentation. Madison looked at her coffee cup. They're talking about you in there, Dominic said. Graves. He's telling them you caused a scene, that you were out of scope, that you... He lowered his voice. He said you may have a history of instability. Did he? Madison. Whatever you know about that patient, whatever you think you know, it's not what I think I know. Then what is it? She looked at him. Dominic Reyes was a decent person. He was going to be a decent doctor if he survived residency and didn't let the hierarchy flatten the parts of him that actually paid attention. She almost told him. But what she would have had to explain first would have taken longer than they had. Go back to your shift, she said. Document everything you observe about that patient. Your own documentation, in your own words, time-stamped. Don't let anyone revise it. Why? Because in about 4 hours, you're going to need it. He stared at her. Then he left. Madison's phone buzzed in her pocket. The text was short. No name, no identifying information. The contact had been carefully maintained for exactly that reason. Not isolated. 3 others in past 48 hours, different cities, same pattern. Who is your patient? She stared at the screen. 3 others. Different cities. Her hands were completely steady, which she knew from experience meant her nervous system had shifted into a particular mode. Not calm exactly, but focused in a way that compressed everything non-essential. She'd felt it once before, in a different country, in a building she wasn't supposed to be in, when a situation became something other than what anyone had planned for. She typed back, unknown identity, no documentation, came in through EMS, no personal effects, need patient 0 protocols. Who's coordinating federal response? 3 minutes passed. Then, BCD is activating. Don't let them close this case as allergic response. Whatever you have to do. BCD, Bioterror Containment Division. Madison had worked adjacent to them once, in a context she still couldn't discuss. If BCD was activating, the 3 other cases weren't being treated as coincidence anymore. She put the phone away. At 3 a.m., Leonard Graves walked into the break room. He wasn't alone. One of the hospital administrators, a thin man named Robert Weil, who handled HR, came with him. They sat down across from her with the coordinated manner of people who had rehearsed this. I'll be direct, Graves said. What happened in Bay 4 tonight was a serious breach of protocol. You overstepped your clinical role, you made unsubstantiated claims that caused disruption to emergency response, and you undermined physician authority in front of federal personnel. The patient is being treated by physicians. He folded his hands on the table. I've spoken with administration and with the federal liaisons present tonight. Given the nature of your behavior and the sensitive federal involvement in this case, we've made the decision to suspend your nursing privileges effective immediately, pending a full review. Madison looked at him. The suspension. Yes. Tonight. Yes. While there's an active, the situation is being handled by appropriate personnel. Weil had a folder open in front of him. He was sliding a form across the table without making eye contact. You'll need to surrender your access card and your facility ID. You'll be contacted within 5 business days regarding the review process. Madison looked at the form. It was pre-filled. Her name, her employee ID, the date and time, 3:02 a.m. The checkbox next to immediate suspension, behavioral/protocol violation, was already marked. This had been prepared before the meeting in the conference room ended, probably during it. She picked up the pen. Weil looked briefly surprised, like he'd expected more resistance. Graves watched her with the carefully neutral expression of someone waiting to see if the situation required additional action. Madison signed the form, slid it back. I'll need a copy, she said. Standard procedure is, I'll need a copy. Weil made a copy. She folded it, put it in the pocket of her scrubs. She stood, reached into her other pocket, and put her access card and ID badge on the table. Then she picked up her coffee cup, walked it to the sink, rinsed it, and left it in the drying rack. She walked out of the break room and down the corridor toward the exit. She was almost at the door when she heard the intercom. Code Orange, Trauma Bay 2. Code Orange, Trauma Bay 2. All available emergency personnel. She stopped walking. Code Orange was Ironcrest's internal designation for an incoming mass casualty event or a second-stage contamination situation. She'd seen it activated twice in 4 years. Once for a multi-vehicle highway accident, once for an industrial chemical exposure at a nearby factory. She turned around. Through the glass doors at the end of the corridor, she could see the ambulance bay. 2 ambulances. Then a third. Then, and this was the part that stopped her completely, the part that made the hair on her arms stand up under her scrubs, a 4th vehicle that was not an ambulance at all. It was military. Dark, unmarked, tactical configuration. Government plates. And behind it, barely visible through the rain that had started while she'd been inside, the shape of another one just like it turning into the hospital access road. Her phone buzzed. She already knew what it said before she looked. Second cluster confirmed. Ravenport Municipal Water System. Estimated exposure window 6 to 14 hours. They have no idea what they're treating. Get back in there. Madison stood at the exit door for exactly 3 seconds. She had no access card. She had a suspension form in her pocket and her name flagged in the system. She had a hospital administration that had spent the last 4 hours positioning her as unstable and disruptive, and a chief physician who had already decided she didn't exist in any way that mattered. She also had a patient in Bay 4 who was dying from something that 3 people in that building knew how to identify, and only one of them was still on the premises. She turned around and walked back into the hospital. The trauma bay was chaos, controlled medical chaos, but chaos nonetheless. The 2 new patients had come in together, another unidentified man and a woman in her 40s who was still partially conscious, enough to be frightened, which made everything harder. Dominic was there, and 2 other residents, and nursing staff who were moving with the particular efficiency of people who were managing a situation they didn't fully understand. Madison walked in like she was supposed to be there. That was the thing about hospitals. If you moved with purpose and wore scrubs and looked like you'd already been briefed, the only people who stopped you were the ones with enough administrative authority to pay attention. In a Code Orange, those people were on the phone. She went to the woman's gurney first. Checked her arm. The branching pattern, less advanced than the first patient, but unmistakably the same. Same geometric spread at the venous junctions. Same asymmetric pupil response. What's her pressure? She asked the nearest nurse, a young man she didn't know well. 86/50 and dropping. Has anyone intubated? Not yet. The She needs to be intubated in the next 8 minutes or she arrests. Madison was already moving, pulling supplies. I need a laryngoscope 7.5 ET tube, and someone needs to tell me if there's any sodium thiosulfate in this bay or if I have to go to the pharmacy. What? Why would we? For the chelation. This isn't anaphylaxis. It's a synthetic organophosphate variant with vascular targeting, and the standard anaphylaxis protocol is going to kill her. I need sodium thiosulfate, and I need atropine, and I need someone to get me the attending on call right now. The young nurse stared at her. Aren't you the nurse that got suspended? Yes. Do you want to have that conversation, or do you want to save her? He turned and ran for the supply room. Dominic appeared at her shoulder. His face was doing something complicated. Madison, I need you to back me up on this, she said quietly, not stopping what she was doing. I know what I'm asking, but look at her arm. Look at the first patient's chart, and look at her arm and tell me it's not the same. Dominic looked. He was quiet for 2 seconds that felt much longer. What do I do? He said. Call the attending. Tell them we have a second presentation consistent with the first. Use those exact words, consistent with the first. And tell them I'm requesting consultation with whoever the federal team is bringing in. They're not going to tell them anyway. She turned back to the patient. The woman's eyes were half open, tracking movement, but barely. Madison put a hand on her arm, the unaffected arm, and leaned close enough to be heard. I know what you were exposed to, she said. I know how to help you. I need you to stay with me for a little while longer. The woman's lips moved. Nothing intelligible came out. I know, Madison said. I know. She straightened up and started preparing for intubation. Behind her, she heard the automatic doors to the trauma bay open. Heard footsteps. Multiple, coordinated. The particular rhythmic cadence of people moving in tactical formation, even in plain clothes. She didn't turn around yet. Then she heard a voice she didn't recognize, male, flat, and authoritative. Who's the clinical lead in this bay? Dominic started to answer. Then another voice, behind the first. And this one she did recognize, even after 2 years, even through the ambient noise of a hospital in crisis mode. That's her, the one in Bay 2. She turned. The man standing in the doorway was wearing civilian clothes. Dark jacket, no insignia. But he had the posture and the particular stillness of someone who had spent a very long time in environments where stillness was a survival skill. Behind him were 3 others, similarly dressed, similarly still. And beside him, a step back, was Agent Vane, who had apparently made a phone call sometime in the past 2 hours that had resulted in this. The man in the dark jacket looked at Madison. His expression didn't give much away. Nurse Hale, he said. Yeah, she said. We need to talk about what you know. I'm a little busy right now. I know. He stepped into the bay, and his team moved with him, one of them going immediately to the second gurney to assess, another pulling out a tablet and starting to photograph the vascular presentation on the woman's arm. They moved like they'd done this before, because they had. The first patient, Madison said. Bay 4. What's his status? The man in the jacket looked at her for a moment. Critical. They've been treating him for anaphylaxis for 3 hours. Pull the protocol. All of it. Right now. She was still preparing the intubation equipment, hands moving on autopilot. He needs chelation, not epinephrine. If they've been running epi on him, we're on it. He nodded to one of his team, who turned and left the bay at speed. Who are you? She asked. Division Commander Holt Reardon, Bioterror Containment Division. She'd heard the name, never met the person. She looked at him once, really looked, the way she'd learned to look at people in situations that didn't leave room for misreading. The municipal water system, she said. Reardon didn't answer right away, which was its own answer. How many people? She said. He looked at the woman on the gurney, at the chart in Dominic's hands, at the team member who was already pulling out a field testing kit and preparing to run a sample from the patient's blood. We don't have a number yet, Reardon said. That's why we need what you know. Madison exhaled once, sharp, through her nose. Put the laryngoscope down for exactly 1 second. Then she picked it up again and turned back to the patient. Then let's get started, she said. Through the glass walls of the trauma bay, in the corridor beyond, she could see Leonard Graves standing very still. watching the federal team that had just walked into his hospital without asking his permission, watching his emergency response meeting become irrelevant in real time. He was looking at Madison. She did not look back. She had work to do. She got the woman intubated in 6 minutes. Not clean. Nothing about it was clean. The patient fought the tube on the way down, which meant Madison had to pause twice, reposition, talk the team through holding her still without compressing the affected arm, because pressure on the vascular presentation at this stage would accelerate spread, and she didn't have time to explain that more than once. Dominic was bagging, Reardon's team member was drawing blood samples simultaneously, and somewhere behind all of it, a monitor was alarming about oxygen saturation in a tone that felt almost personal. But it went in. Tube confirmed by capnography. Saturation climbing. Madison stepped back, stripped her gloves, pulled on a fresh pair. She needs the chelation protocol started in the next 30 minutes, she said to no one in particular and everyone present. If the pharmacy doesn't have sodium thiosulfate in sufficient quantity, I need to know that right now, not in 20 minutes. On it, said one of Reardon's people. A woman, compact, with the kind of focus that suggested she'd done field triage in places with far fewer resources than this. Reardon himself had been on a phone call for the past 4 minutes, standing near the bay entrance with his back half turned, speaking in a voice too low to catch. Now he ended the call and came back to Madison. How certain are you, he said, that this is V7 and not a variant? 75%. She was charting the intubation, time-stamping everything. The branching pattern and the progression rate match V7 field documentation, but the onset window is faster than what we recorded overseas. Either the formulation's been modified or the delivery mechanism is different, or both. Faster how much? Original V7 in field exposure. Symptomatic onset was 12 to 18 hours post-exposure. This patient and the first one were symptomatic within 4 to 6, which means either the concentration in the water system is significantly higher than any quantity we'd previously seen deployed, or someone's been engineering for faster penetration. Reardon looked at her without expression for a moment. You shouldn't know that field data. No, Madison agreed. I shouldn't. He let it sit there for a second. Then, we're going to need everything you remember. All of it. I know. The brief will happen here, in the building. I can't move you to a command facility tonight. We don't have time and I need you where these patients are. I'm suspended, she said, in case that creates a jurisdictional problem for you. Something shifted in Reardon's face. Not quite amusement, more like the recognition of an absurdity that he didn't have the bandwidth to fully appreciate. Hospital administration doesn't have jurisdiction over a federal bioterror response. You're operating under BCD authority as of, he checked his watch, 43 minutes ago. Your suspension is administratively irrelevant for the duration of the emergency. Is that in writing somewhere? It will be. Well, then someone needs to tell Dr. Graves that. Reardon looked toward the corridor where Graves was still visible, no longer standing still, now moving, talking to Vile, both of them with the tight posture of people who had just realized the situation had moved past them and were trying to figure out how to get back in front of it. Let me worry about Graves, Reardon said. Madison looked at him. I'd rather worry about him myself. I know you would. Do it after we stabilize the water system situation. He turned toward his team. Marsh, get the patient 0 file to Nurse Hale. Full presentation documentation. Everything vein forwarded from the first intake. He looked back at Madison. Read it fast. I need your analysis in 20 minutes. I'm still treating patients. I know. Read it anyway. He walked away. That was apparently how Division Commander Holt Reardon operated. He gave you something impossible and walked away before you could negotiate it down to something merely difficult. Madison went back to the second gurney and checked the woman's pressure, coming up slowly. She adjusted the ventilator settings, noted the time, and held out her hand behind her without looking. After a half-second pause, one of Reardon's people put a tablet in it. She read while monitoring. It wasn't graceful, but it worked. The patient 0 file was thin, not because there wasn't information, but because most of it was still being assembled in real time. The man from Bay 4 had been tentatively identified through a partial fingerprint match. Garrett Olm, age 53. Maintenance contractor for the Ravenport Municipal Water Authority. Employed there for 9 months. Prior employment history that jumped around in a way that suggested either a troubled work record or a carefully constructed cover. The water authority connection hit her like stepping off a curb she hadn't seen. She read it twice to make sure she'd understood it right. Then she lowered the tablet and looked at the wall for exactly 2 seconds. Maintenance contractor, water authority, 9 months. Long enough to understand the system, not so long as to become conspicuous. The exposure window she'd estimated, 4 to 6 hours for symptomatic onset, mapped almost precisely to the end of the previous evening's water treatment cycle. Someone hadn't accidentally introduced V7 into the Ravenport water system. Someone had planned this with enough operational knowledge to time it against the treatment cycle, which meant they understood water processing, which meant Garrett Ulm either was part of the operation or had been used by someone who was. She put the tablet down on the supply shelf, marked the time on the chart, and went to find Reardon. He was in the corridor outside the trauma bay, now with 3 additional people she hadn't seen arrive. 2 in what looked like CDC field gear, 1 in a suit that meant federal something. The conversation stopped when she approached, which told her the thing they'd been discussing was something they hadn't decided yet whether to share with her. Garrett Ulm worked water treatment, she said. Reardon nodded once. The previous shift before EMS picked him up. What time did it end? 7:45 p.m. And the first symptomatic presentation came into my bay at 11:47. She did the math out loud because she wanted it on record, wanted other people's ears on it. 4 hours, 2 minutes. That's not accidental contamination. That's not a containment failure. Someone introduced this compound during his shift, and he either did it himself or he was used to provide access to someone who did. The suited federal official, older man, gray at the temples, the look of someone who had been doing something classified for long enough that it had become ordinary, said, "That's a significant inference from limited data." It's not an inference, it's a timeline. Madison kept her eyes on Reardon, not on the suit. "You have more of the data than I do. Tell me I'm wrong." Reardon didn't tell her she was wrong. "The second cluster," she said, What's the estimated exposure population?" The suited man said, "She's cleared," Reardon said. Flat and final. A beat. Then the suit said, "Current estimate is between 400 and 900 people in the affected distribution zone. That number is not confirmed and may shift significantly depending on the contamination concentration and individual exposure duration." 900 people. Madison kept her face still. There were a lot of things she'd learned to keep off her face when she was in situations where how she reacted mattered as much as what she did. "Treatment timeline," she said. "If we're looking at 4 to 6 hour symptomatic onset, the earliest exposure wave would have started showing symptoms around midnight. It's now..." She glanced at the clock on the wall. 4:21 a.m., which means the symptomatic population right now is people who were exposed in the first wave. We're about to hit the second wave in the next 2 hours if the exposure window ran through the full treatment cycle. "That's the current modeling," said the CDC rep in the field gear. "Ironcrest isn't big enough," Madison said. "This ER has 12 trauma bays and 43 available beds. If 200 people show up symptomatic before 7 a.m., we're activating the Civic Center as an overflow facility," Reardon said. "MCI protocols are going out in the next 30 minutes. You need clinical guidance for the intake teams at the overflow site. People who know what they're treating, because if they go in assuming allergic response or standard organophosphate poisoning, they're going to make it worse." "Yes," Reardon said. "We do." She looked at him. He looked back. "Write me a protocol sheet," he said. 2 pages. Everything a triage nurse needs to know to identify this presentation and initiate the right treatment without waiting for a physician confirmation. Plain language, nothing classified, nothing that requires prior knowledge of V7, just clinical presentation and response. "You want me to write a treatment protocol?" "In the next 40 minutes. Yes." "I'm still monitoring 2 patients." "Marsh can monitor. You write." She wanted to point out approximately 4 things wrong with that request, starting with the fact that she was a staff nurse who had just been suspended, and ending with the ethical complexity of writing a protocol based on classified information about a classified compound for use in a public medical crisis. She held all 4 of those things in her head for a moment. Give me a laptop and a quiet corner, she said. So, the quiet corner turned out to be a supply closet off the secondary corridor that someone had cleared out enough to fit a folding chair and a small table. Not quiet exactly. She could hear the controlled chaos of the ER through the wall, but contained, which was close enough. She wrote for 32 minutes straight. It wasn't elegant writing. She wasn't going for elegant. She was going for clear, specific, and sequenced in a way that a tired triage nurse at 4 in the morning could follow without having to make interpretive leaps. Clinical presentation differentiated from anaphylaxis and standard organophosphate poisoning by 3 key indicators. Immediate response priorities in order. Contraindications. What to watch for in the first 2 hours post-treatment. She kept her language clean of anything that would raise questions about how she knew what she knew. Framed it as pattern-based assessment from observed presentations, which was true technically, just not the whole truth. When she came out of the supply closet, Dominic was waiting in the corridor. He looked like he hadn't decided yet whether he was more frightened or angry, which in her experience usually meant someone had just told him something that contradicted something else he'd been told, and he was trying to figure out which version of reality to stand in. "Graves is looking for you," he said. "I know." He went to find Reardon. They've been in Graves's office for the past 15 minutes with the door closed and 2 federal agents outside it. That was interesting. She kept walking toward the trauma bay. "How's the first patient?" Dominic fell into step beside her. "Stable. They switched his protocol 40 minutes ago, and his vascular presentation has stopped progressing. He's not out of it, but he stopped getting worse, which 20 minutes ago felt impossible." "Good." "Madison." He grabbed her arm gently to stop her. She stopped. "What is happening? I mean, actually, what is this?" She looked at him. Dominic Reyes, with his panicked face and his good instincts and his genuine desire to understand, standing in a hospital corridor at 4:30 in the morning while the situation around him rearranged itself into something that bore no resemblance to an ordinary Tuesday night. "Someone put something in the water," she said. "Something that was never supposed to exist outside of classified military research. Somewhere between 400 and 900 people in this city may have been exposed to it. We're about to have more patients than this hospital can hold, and the treatment protocol that was running for the past 3 hours on a man in Bay 4 was making him worse, not better." She paused. "That's what's happening." Dominic's mouth opened slightly, then closed. "The thing you said earlier," he said, "about documenting everything." "Yes." "I did. I have timestamps on everything. Every order Graves gave, every time I raised a flag and was overruled, every time the patient's presentation changed and didn't match the anaphylaxis model." She looked at him differently now. He'd done it without knowing why it mattered, just because she'd asked him to, and he'd trusted that she had a reason. That took something. Not everyone had it. "Keep it somewhere safe," she said. "Not in the hospital system." He patted his jacket pocket. "Personal phone, photographed it." "Good." She started walking again. "Are we in trouble, E?" he asked. "Graves might be," she said. "We're fine." She said it with more certainty than she felt, because that was what the situation required. The Civic Center overflow facility was operational by 6 a.m., which was faster than Madison would have thought possible, and still not fast enough. By 5:45, the Ironcrest ER waiting room was at capacity, and 2 more ambulances were holding in the bay. The symptomatic second wave had started arriving at 5:15. Not the flood they'd been anticipating, but a steady stream, enough to make it real, enough to confirm the timeline. Reardon's team was moving through the intake area, distributing Madison's protocol sheet, which had been formatted and reproduced by someone on his staff in the time it took her to walk back from the supply closet. She didn't know exactly what she expected to feel, seeing it in other people's hands. Something, maybe, some version of vindication, or at least recognition. What she actually felt was tired and tightly focused, and not particularly interested in anything except whether it was working. It was working. The triage nurses at the Civic Center were using it. She knew because one of them called in a question at 6:12, a patient presenting with the vascular sign but no pupil asymmetry, asking whether that ruled out the compound, and Madison talked them through it. Pupil asymmetry wasn't universal in early-stage presentation. The branching pattern was the primary indicator. Treat based on the pattern. The call lasted 4 minutes. The nurse on the other end sounded exhausted and shaky and steady all at once. The particular quality of someone doing something very hard and not stopping. After she hung up, Madison sat in the corridor for a moment and let herself feel how tired she was. Not for long, just long enough to acknowledge it. Then her phone buzzed with something that wasn't a text or a call. It was an email, delivered to her personal account from a sender she didn't recognize, an address that was a string of letters and numbers, the kind of thing a routing anonymizer produced. The subject line was blank. The body contained one sentence and an attached document. The sentence was, "You should know who authorized the Water Authority contract." She opened the attachment. It was a procurement document, a contract between the Ravenport Municipal Water Authority and a private environmental testing company called Drexel Meridian Solutions, dated 14 months ago. The contracted scope of work was listed as routine chemical compliance testing and system calibration. Her eyes went to the signature line at the bottom. The authorizing signature on the hospital side, because there was a hospital connection, the document made that explicit, citing a partnership between Ironcrest Regional and Drexel Meridian for medical wastewater management, was Leonard Graves. Not in his capacity as a physician, in his capacity as a member of the Ironcrest Regional Hospital Board of Directors. She read the document again. The company name, Drexel Meridian Solutions, meant nothing to her immediately. But the structure of the contract did. The scope language was vague in the specific way that legal documents were vague when the real purpose of the arrangement wasn't something you wanted spelled out. System calibration could mean anything. Chemical compliance testing by a private firm contracted through a hospital board member to a municipal utility was the kind of arrangement that should have raised flags through 3 layers of oversight. She thought about Garrett Ulm, 9 months employed by the Water Authority, hired after this contract was signed. She thought about V7, which had been developed in classified military research and then supposedly destroyed. She thought about someone who would need to test a compound they'd reintroduced before they could sell it, and about what a municipal water system would be as a test environment. Controlled population, known distribution, measurable symptomatic onset, collectible outcomes data. Not a terrorist attack in the traditional sense, a product test. The thought landed in her chest like something cold and heavy. She sat with it for exactly the time it took to confirm she wasn't wrong about it. Then she stood up and went to find Reardon. He wasn't in the corridor. He wasn't at the nursing station or in the trauma bay. One of his team members told her he'd stepped outside for a call. She went to the ambulance bay. He was there, standing in the rain that was still coming down, lighter now, but steady, with the phone to his ear. He saw her coming, and something in his posture changed. The particular shift of someone who'd just been told something that connected to something else, in a way that wasn't good. He ended the call as she reached him. "Drexel Meridian Solutions," she said. He looked at her. "Where did you hear that?" "Someone emailed me a procurement document." Graves signed a contract between Ironcrest and Drexel Meridian 14 months ago through his board seat. Drexel Meridian was contracted to the Water Authority for, quote, system calibration. She held up her phone with the document open. The Garrett Ulm hire was 9 months ago, 5 months after this contract was signed. Reardon looked at the document for a long time. His expression was doing something careful and contained. "What do you know about Drexel Meridian?" she asked. "More than I should have to know about a company that filed as an environmental testing firm 18 months ago. He paused. "It's a shell. We've been looking at it in a different context for the past 6 weeks. Flagged it as a potential front for research sales, bio and chemical to..." He stopped. "I can't get into the full picture here." "But Graves," she said, "is a person of significant interest, yes." He said it in the flat tone of someone confirming something that was no longer a question. This document moves him from significant interest to something more formal. "He's in his office right now," Madison said, "with 2 of your agents outside the door." "I know where he is." "Does he know what you know?" Reardon looked at her steadily. "Not yet." The rain was getting into her collar. She didn't move. When he figures out that Garrett Ulm is your patient, that you have a tentative ID, that the Water Authority connection is open, he's going to run. "I'm aware. I'm telling you he's going to run soon, not tomorrow, not in 2 hours. She held his gaze. He's been in that office for 40 minutes with federal agents outside the door, and he has a board member's understanding of institutional risk. He knows what this looks like. He's calculating right now. Reardon looked at her for one more second. Then he pulled his radio off his belt. He said 4 words into it. "Lock down Graves's office." There was a pause of about 3 seconds. Then his radio came back with a voice that was trying to be level and not quite making it. "Commander, Dr. Graves is not in his office." Madison closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. When she opened them, Reardon was already moving, and she was moving with him, back through the ambulance bay doors into the hospital, and she could see it from where she stood. The office at the end of the administrative corridor, door still slightly ajar the way it would be if someone had left in a hurry. The 2 agents outside it with the rigid posture of people who'd just made a mistake they understood the full weight of. But that wasn't what stopped her. What stopped her was the phone call she got in that exact moment. Her personal phone, the number she hadn't used in 2 years until tonight, the contact that had texted her about BCD activation and 3 other cases. She picked up. "Madison." The voice was different than she expected. Not a text-to-speech relay, not an anonymized route. A real voice, someone she'd known once, someone who'd been in the same rooms in the same classified context. V7's original research file, the one from the Black Site lab. "We just pulled it out of archive storage." "Okay," she said carefully, still moving through the corridor. "It's been accessed 6 times in the past 18 months. Unofficial access, off the standard clearance log." "By who?" "The access credential that was used," the voice said, "belongs to someone who was listed as a civilian medical consultant on the original V7 research team." She already knew what was coming. The shape of it had been assembling in her head for the past 20 minutes without her letting herself see it fully. "Name," she said. "Dr. Leonard Graves," the voice said. "He wasn't just a board member with a contract. He was there from the beginning." The corridor was empty ahead of her. The administrative suite, the office, the 2 agents standing uselessly at the door. And somewhere in this building, or already outside it, was the man who had spent 11 years running a hospital as cover for something else entirely, who had humiliated her and suspended her and tried to put her name on the wrong side of this, and who had just realized that the nurse he'd thrown out of his emergency response meeting 3 hours ago had just become the single biggest threat to everything he'd built. She was already moving before the call ended. Reardon was 6 feet ahead of her, and she matched his pace without discussion, both of them heading toward the main lobby because that was the fastest exit, and if Graves had a car or a contact outside the building, he'd go for the most direct route, not the one that required navigation. People under pressure defaulted to the familiar. She'd seen it enough times to count on it. "He was on the original research team," she said as they moved. "Say that again." "V7, the Black Site Development Program." Graves was a civilian medical consultant. He's had access to the research file for 18 months through credentials that weren't supposed to be active anymore. Reardon got on his radio without breaking stride. "All exits. Now. Gray Volvo in the physician lot. Plate starts with RVP. I need confirmation, and I need it in 30 seconds." They came through the internal door into the main lobby, and Madison saw immediately that the lobby was no longer the quiet midnight space it had been 4 hours ago. There were people, not many, 7 or 8, but enough to register, sitting in the waiting area with the particular stillness of people who'd come in scared and been told to wait. 2 were showing early symptomatic signs. One woman had her forearm resting on her knee, and even from across the lobby, Madison could see the beginning of the branching pattern. She made herself keep moving. The front entrance, the parking lot beyond the glass doors. It was still raining, heavier now, and in the gray pre-dawn light, the lot was awash of wet pavement and headlights from vehicles that were either arriving or had been there long enough to fog the windows. No gray Volvo in the physician section. Space was empty. Either the car was already gone or it had never been there tonight, and neither option was good. Reardon's radio crackled. "Commander? Physician lot is clear. Security footage shows a gray Volvo exiting the south gate at 0458. 4:58. 11 minutes ago. Reardon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He turned slightly away and made a call that Madison wasn't meant to hear, which meant she stepped back 2 paces and gave him that, because she wasn't under the illusion that she controlled this part. Graves running was a federal problem. Finding him was BCD and whatever agencies Reardon had on speed dial. She turned around and walked back through the lobby. The woman with the forearm presentation was still sitting in the same chair. Madison crouched down in front of her. The woman was in her 50s, Hispanic, dressed like she'd been at work when symptoms started. Dress slacks, blouse, one shoe that didn't quite match the other, like she'd grabbed the wrong one in a hurry. "Can I look at your arm?" Madison asked. The woman looked at her. "Are you a doctor?" "Nurse. I know what you have, and I know how to treat it." She kept her voice level and direct because that was what the woman needed right now, not reassurance theater. "I need to look at your arm." The woman extended it without another word. Madison examined the pattern. Early stage, maybe 2 hours in, the branching visible at the inner wrist but not yet progressing toward the elbow. "You're early enough," Madison said. "The treatment works when it's early. I need to get you into the back right now." "My husband is at home," the woman said. "He was feeling sick too. I left him because I thought he was just tired, and What's his address?" She said it. Madison repeated it twice in her head so it would stick, stood, and flagged down the nearest intake nurse. "Get her into a bay chelation protocol, the sheet Reardon's team distributed. And I need someone to call this address for a wellness check. Possible secondary exposure, single occupant." She gave the address. The intake nurse was already moving. Madison went back to the trauma bay. Garrett Olm, patient 0, was still critical but stable. Stable in the way that meant he hadn't gotten worse in the last 30 minutes, which was the best they could say. His vascular presentation had stopped spreading at the upper arm after the protocol switch. The woman from Bay 2 was on the ventilator. Pressure better? The chelation doing what it was supposed to do more slowly than Madison would have liked, but doing it. She stood at the foot of the second gurney and looked at the woman's chart and did the thing she did when she was running low on sleep and high on adrenaline. She went methodical. Systematically checked everything. Looked at the numbers not as an intuitive gestalt, but as individual data points, each one either matching expectations or not, each deviation either explained or requiring action. Potassium was drifting low. She noted it, ordered a correction. Ventilator pressure was slightly elevated, suggesting the lung involvement was progressing even as the vascular presentation stabilized. She adjusted settings by small increments, documented the rationale for each adjustment, and made a note that this patient would need pulmonology consult if she made it to the next 12 hours. She did all of this in about 8 minutes. Then she went to the supply closet to get more gloves and found Dominic already in there, sitting on an overturned supply crate with his phone in his hand, looking like someone had hit him with something blunt. "What happened?" "Graves is gone," he said. "I know. The nursing staff. Some of them are saying you caused this somehow, that you're the reason we didn't catch it sooner." He looked up. "Krantz, in the ICU. She was in that emergency meeting Graves called. She's been telling people that Graves flagged you as a problem weeks ago, that this isn't the first time you've—" "Dominic." She said it simply, without heat. "Is that what you think?" He was quiet for a second. "No." "Okay." She took the gloves. "Then let Krantz say what she's going to say. It won't matter in a few hours." "How do you know that?" She looked at him. "Because the documentation exists, mine, yours, the federal record. Things that are real leave traces, and things that are constructed fall apart when you compare those traces against each other." That's a very calm way to look at someone actively trying to bury you. It's the only useful way to look at it. She left the supply closet. The next hour was the hardest kind of hard. Not dramatic, not acute, just sustained and relentless. The patient volume at the Civic Center overflow was climbing faster than the modeling had predicted, which meant the projection of 400 to 900 exposed had been optimistic. The second treatment wave required more atropine than the pharmacy's on-hand supply, which required an emergency pharmaceutical transfer from Mercy General across the city, which took time nobody had. Reardon's team was stretched across 2 facilities and a mobile command unit that had arrived in the parking lot at some point while Madison wasn't watching and was now the de facto operations center. She functioned as a bridge between the clinical and the federal side in a way that had evolved without being officially established, answering questions from the Civic Center triage team, feeding observational data to Reardon's analysts, keeping the treatment protocol updated as new presentations came in that refined her understanding of the compound's behavior in different populations. Older patients had faster vascular progression. Patients with pre-existing cardiovascular conditions needed the chelation dose adjusted. She made notes, passed them to Reardon's medical officer, watched them get incorporated into the field guidance. She had not slept. She was aware of this in the background, a persistent noise she was managing to route around. At 7:40 a.m., Reardon came to find her. He had the look of someone who had received news that was both good and bad in ways that he was separating in his head before deciding how to share them. He sat down across from her at the small table someone had set up in the corridor as a makeshift documentation station. "We have a Graves sighting," he said. Tollway camera picked up the vehicle at 0612, heading south toward the state line. "He's running." "Yes. We have state police coordination active and a federal intercept team repositioning. He's not going to make it across the state line." He said it with the flat confidence of someone who wasn't guessing. "But there's something else." She waited. "His office. We went through it properly about 40 minutes ago." Reardon put a photograph on the table. This was in a locked drawer, physical copies only, no digital footprint. She looked at the photograph. It was a document. She could see the format, the header, the layout of what looked like a research protocol or a laboratory report. She couldn't read it at this resolution. "What is it?" "A Phase 2 outcomes report," Reardon said, "for something called Project Meridian Bridge." The company name again. Drexel Meridian Solutions. She looked at him. "It's not just a front company," he said. "Drexel Meridian has been running a covert bio-research operation for the past 3 years. The V7 formulation that's in our water system isn't the original compound from the Black Site program. It's a modified version, faster onset, higher penetration rate, more stable in aqueous environments." He paused. "They built a better version of it, and they've been testing it." "Here," she said. "They were testing it here." Ravenport was the third test location. The other two were smaller, private water supplies, rural communities, event attributed to agricultural chemical contamination both times. 13 deaths across the 2 prior events that we now believe were Drexel test runs. His voice stayed even, but something behind it didn't. They had outcome data. They knew what it did. Ravenport was scale testing. Madison sat with that for a moment. 13 people had died in communities where everyone thought it was agricultural runoff. 13 people while Graves sat in his office at Ironcrest and reviewed the outcomes data. "Who were they selling it to?" she asked. "We don't have full intelligence on that yet. What we have suggests multiple interested parties, none of them domestic." He looked at her. "The research file that was accessed through Graves's credentials over the past 18 months, we think he was using the original V7 documentation to validate Drexel Meridian's modified version. Proof of concept. Prior successful deployment. He was using classified military research to sell a civilian-engineered version of the same weapon. That's the working theory." She exhaled through her nose. Outside the corridor window, she could see the parking lot where the mobile command unit had set up. The vehicles, the personnel, the particular organized chaos of a federal operation running at full tilt. It had been 6 hours since she'd stood in the trauma bay and said 2 words into a room full of people who were about to dismiss her. "How many people in the building right now know about Project Meridian Bridge?" she asked. "My core team, the senior federal officials on site, you, as of 3 minutes ago." "What about Graves? Does he know what you found in his office?" "He left before we went in." Reardon's expression was careful. "But Graves is not a stupid man. He knows we would search it. Which means he knows what we found." "Yes. Which means—" She stopped. Her mind went somewhere specific. To the document she'd received by email, the anonymous sender, the procurement records that had arrived at exactly the right moment to tie Graves to the Water Authority contract. She'd handed that to Reardon immediately and hadn't thought about the sender again because there was too much else to think about. But now she thought about it. Someone had sent her that document. Someone who had access to procurement records, who knew her personal email, who wanted to make sure the Graves-Drexel Meridian connection was visible. Someone who knew the operation from inside. "The email I received," she said. "The procurement document. Have you traced the sender?" "Still working on it." "Is it possible Graves has someone inside your operation?" The pause before Reardon answered was 3 seconds long, which was 1 second longer than it should have been if the answer was no. It's possible, he said. Or, she said, someone inside Drexel Meridian wanted Graves caught. Someone who wanted out and decided that collapsing the operation from the inside was safer than trying to walk away. Reardon looked at her steadily. He didn't confirm or deny it. He didn't have to. The Phase 2 report, she said. What does it document? Just outcomes or the full research methodology, the modified formulation details, the delivery mechanism specifications, and the names of the intended buyers? He picked the photograph up off the table. It's everything we need. And Graves left it. He left it, she said slowly, in a locked drawer. She turned that over in her mind. Graves was not a stupid man. She'd said that. Reardon had agreed. A man who'd run a covert bioweapons testing operation for 3 years from behind the cover of a hospital administration position did not accidentally leave the evidence of his entire operation in his office when he ran. He left it because someone told him to leave it, she said, or because he planned to come back for it. Reardon's phone went off. He looked at the screen and his expression changed. The shift of someone receiving information that required immediate action. He stood. The intercept team, he said. They have a visual on the vehicle. She stood too. Not because she expected to be included in an intercept operation. She wasn't delusional about her role here, but because the energy of the past 7 hours was not compatible with sitting still when something critical was breaking. Reardon was already talking into his phone, moving down the corridor. She stood where she was and listened to the half of the conversation she could hear. What she could hear was a location, a tollway designation she recognized as the southern approach to the state border. Then a pause. Then Reardon's voice changing in register by a degree that she'd learned in the past 6 hours corresponded to something unexpected. He stopped walking, turned back toward her. The vehicle, he said. State police pulled it over at mile marker 84. And? He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Graves isn't in it. She stared at him. There's a driver, male, mid-40s, not Graves. The car was... Another pause as something came through his earpiece. Apparently borrowed, or commandeered. The driver is claiming he was paid $200 to take the car south, and he has no knowledge of the passenger's identity. Graves switched vehicles, she said, at some point between the tollway sighting and the intercept. Yes. Then where is he? Reardon's face said what his mouth was taking a moment to catch up to, and Madison felt it before he said it. The thing she should have thought of 40 minutes ago, the thing that had been sitting in the logic of the situation the whole time, and that she'd been too focused on the patients and the protocol and the research file to see. The command unit, she said, the mobile command unit in the parking lot. It has the full case file, the evidence your team pulled from his office, the names of the buyers, the research report. It's secure. It's a hardened federal. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She picked up because of the morning she'd had. Silence for 1 second. Then a voice she recognized immediately, even though she'd only heard it in person twice. Smooth, controlled, the voice of a man who had spent 11 years in positions of authority and had learned to use that smoothness as a kind of armor. Leonard Graves said, I need you to tell Reardon to pull his team back from the command unit. She kept her voice completely flat. Where are you? That's not relevant right now. A pause. I know you found the report. I know what Reardon has. I'm asking you to tell him to give me 30 minutes. In exchange for what? In exchange for information about the buyers, Graves said. The names in that report are partial. I have the rest. And I have something Reardon doesn't know exists yet. She looked at Reardon, who was watching her face with the attention of someone who could tell from the look of her that the call mattered. She mouthed, Graves. Reardon went very still. What don't we know exists, she said into the phone. Another pause, longer this time. When Graves spoke again, something in his voice had shifted. The smoothness fractured just slightly, the way a surface fractured when the pressure underneath it had been building too long. There's a second compound, he said, Meridian 2. V7 was the proof of concept. Meridian 2 is what they actually plan to sell. It's already been synthesized, it's already packaged, and it is not in Ravenport. The corridor was very quiet. If your team arrests me in the next 30 minutes before I can hand over the location data, Graves said, you will have shut down one test operation and left the actual weapon in the hands of people who don't need me anymore to use it. Madison looked at Reardon. She held the phone slightly away from her ear so he could hear. His expression had gone somewhere hard and absolute. She put the phone back to her ear. I'll deliver your message, she said. Stay on the line. Madison. His voice was different now, stripped of authority for the first time she could remember, down to something raw. I know how this looks. It looks exactly like what it is, she said. Stay on the line. She lowered the phone and looked at Reardon. He was already on his radio. Somewhere outside, the operation that had been converging on Graves's location was about to become something much more complicated. And in her hand, the phone stayed live. Graves's breathing audible, thin and unsteady, the sound of a man who had run as far as he could run and was discovering that the distance he'd covered hadn't been nearly enough. Reardon made 3 calls in the next 90 seconds while Madison kept Graves on the line. She didn't speak. Graves didn't speak either, which told her he understood the dynamic. He'd made his offer. Now he was waiting to see if it changed anything, and filling the silence would only weaken his position. Whatever else he was, he understood leverage. He'd been leveraging things his entire career. Reardon finished his calls and looked at her. He held up one finger, "Give me 1 more minute," and walked 6 steps away to speak to 2 of his team members in a voice low enough that she couldn't track it. She watched his hands while he talked. When people controlled their voice, their hands usually told the truth. Reardon's hands were doing something tightly contained, the gestures of someone working through a decision under significant time pressure. He came back. Tell him we need proof of the Meridian 2 location before any conversation about terms, Reardon said. She relayed it. A pause on Graves's end. Then, I can give him a facility address. 1 location. Confirmation of what's there has to come from someone who can verify the synthesis documentation, not just a warehouse with boxes. Another pause. He'll need your analysis, he knows that. She looked at Reardon, repeated it. Something shifted in Reardon's expression. Not agreement, but the acknowledgement that the logic was sound in a way that was inconvenient. He needed someone who could look at a synthesized compound and confirm it was what Graves claimed, and that someone was standing in front of him holding a phone. Address first, Reardon said. She told Graves. Graves gave an address. A storage and logistics facility in a light industrial area 12 miles south of Ravenport, a place that would have looked entirely ordinary from the outside. The kind of building that could hold anything without attracting attention. Reardon had it in the system in 40 seconds. His team pulled satellite imagery, city permit records, the name on the lease. The leaseholder was a subsidiary of a subsidiary that traced back through 3 corporate layers to Drexel Meridian Solutions. It's real, said the analyst at the mobile command unit, her voice coming through Reardon's earpiece. The address is real. Reardon looked at Madison. Tell him we're sending a team. He won't stay on the line if you send a team without... Tell him we're sending a team, Reardon said, and ask him where he is right now. She relayed the first part. Graves went quiet for 4 seconds. He's not going to tell me where he is, she said, not waiting for an answer that wasn't coming. I know, Reardon said. I needed him thinking about both questions at once. He was already walking toward the exit. You're coming with me. The logistics facility sat at the end of a service road between 2 larger warehouses, one of which appeared to store restaurant equipment and the other auto parts, based on the signage. The kind of industrial block that existed in every mid-sized city. Not prosperous enough to attract investment, not run down enough to attract attention. 4 BCD vehicles. State police blocking the service road at both ends. A tactical team that Reardon had not introduced to Madison, but who moved with the efficiency of people who had done facility entries in much less controlled circumstances than this. She was not tactical. She knew this. She stayed behind the vehicles with one of Reardon's analysts, a woman named Priya, who had been running the evidence chain from the mobile command unit and who wore the careful expression of someone doing 3 things at once in her head, and waited. The entry took 6 minutes, long enough to feel long. Then Reardon's voice on the radio. Secure. Hale, I need you inside. She went in. The facility was climate controlled, which you noticed immediately coming in from the November rain. A slight positive pressure, the air quality different, the kind of environmental management you installed when you were storing something that required stable conditions. The main floor was warehouse space, mostly empty, no product, no ordinary commercial inventory. What it had instead was laboratory infrastructure that someone had built into a back section behind a wall that looked like structural warehouse framing from the front and was, from behind, a sealed research environment. Reardon was standing at a long work surface. On it, sealed containers, documentation folders, equipment whose purpose Madison could identify by type, even though she'd never worked with it outside of classified context. A synthesis setup. Not active. Nothing running, nothing processing, but recently used. The air had that particular quality of a space where chemical work had happened in the past 24 to 48 hours. "Tell me what you're seeing," Reardon said. She pulled on gloves from the kit his team had ready and moved along the work surface. Looked at the containers without touching. Read the labeling. Coded, not plain text, but the coding structure was consistent with what she'd seen in V7 documentation years earlier, modified for a derivative compound. "This is consistent with what he described," she said. "Meridian 2 as a stabilized aqueous compound, higher penetration rate, designed for different delivery mechanisms than V7. She looked at the volume. "This isn't a test batch. This is production quantity. Enough for... I can't quantify without running the concentration data, but more than Ravenport." Reardon's jaw worked for a second. He picked up his radio. While he talked, Madison moved to the documentation folders, looked at the structure of the materials, research logs, synthesis records, quality control notation. Standard research documentation format, the kind she'd seen in legitimate lab settings, which was the point. If any of this was ever subpoenaed or examined superficially, it would read as ordinary research process. She opened the third folder. The first document inside was a purchase agreement, not a chemical purchase agreement, a sale agreement, 2 parties, one identified by a company name she didn't recognize, the other by a code designation that Reardon's analysts would need to run. The subject of the agreement was described in technical language that was careful to avoid any term that would be plainly incriminating. But the quantity figures, the delivery schedule, and the pricing structure were not compatible with any legitimate commercial application. She turned to the next document, and the next. By the 5th document, she had a picture that was detailed enough to be conclusive and disturbing enough that she had to take a deliberate breath before she turned to Reardon. "There are 4 buyers," she said, "not 1. The sale was structured as 4 separate tranches, different delivery windows, different destination specifications. 2 tranches have already been paid for." She held up the folder. The delivery schedule on the first tranche was this week. Reardon looked at the folder for exactly as long as it took to understand what that meant. Then he turned and issued a rapid sequence of orders to his team that Madison tracked only partially. She understood enough to know that what had been a regional emergency response was now becoming something considerably larger. She put the folder down carefully on the work surface. Outside, through the thin walls of the facility, she could hear additional vehicles arriving. They brought Graves in at 10:43 a.m., not from a highway intercept and not from a dramatic foot pursuit. He was found in a motel 7 miles from the logistics facility, in a room registered under a name that wasn't his, using a credit card that traced to an account that had been inactive for 4 years. He'd apparently eaten half a room service sandwich and then sat on the edge of the bed and not moved, which was where the tactical team found him when they came through the door, sitting there, still in the clothes he'd worn to the hospital, looking like a man who had finally run all the way to the end of his own resources and discovered there was nothing on the other side. Madison wasn't there for the arrest. She was back at Ironcrest because the patients were still there, and the patients didn't care about Drexel Meridian's sales structure or the federal operation expanding around the case. She found out about the arrest from Dominic, who heard it from one of Reardon's team members who'd stayed at the hospital. Dominic told her in the corridor quietly, with the look of someone who wasn't sure how to read her reaction. "They got him." "I know." She was updating a chart. She finished the notation before she looked up. "That's it? You know?" "What would you like me to say?" He opened his mouth, closed it. "I don't know. Something. You've been awake for... How long have you been awake?" She thought about it. Since yesterday afternoon. You should sleep. When the census drops below critical, I'll sleep. She moved to the next chart. The woman from Bay 2 was, has the pulmonology consult happened yet? He sighed. No, I'll call them again. Thank you. She worked until noon. Then she sat down in the break room with the intention of taking 15 minutes and instead put her head on her folded arms on the table and fell asleep in approximately 90 seconds. She slept for 2 hours and 20 minutes, which she knew because she'd looked at the clock when she sat down, and she looked at it again when Karen Solis touched her shoulder and said her name. She sat up. Her neck hurt. The break room smelled like burned coffee and someone's microwaved lunch. Reardon's here, Karen said. He wants to talk to you when you're ready. Give me 5 minutes. She washed her face in the break room sink, dried it on paper towels, looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. She looked like someone who had been awake for 20 hours and then slept badly on a cafeteria table. That was accurate. She could work with it. Riordan was in a small conference room off the administrative corridor, not Graves's office, which was still sealed as an evidence site, but the one used for staff meetings. He had coffee for her. She took it without comment and sat down. The facility is fully documented, he said. The synthesis records, the sale agreements, the buyer identification. It's comprehensive. Whoever built Drexel Meridian's research operation kept meticulous records, which is both professionally impressive and strategically catastrophic for them. Graves kept the records, she said. Graves kept some of them. The laboratory documentation was maintained by the research staff. 3 individuals we've identified and located. 2 were in the facility when we entered. The third, he paused, was Garrett Ulm. She looked up from her coffee. Ulm wasn't just a maintenance contractor with Water Authority access, Reardon said. He had a chemistry background. Worked in pharmaceutical manufacturing for 8 years before his employment history gets complicated. Drexel Meridian recruited him specifically for the Ravenport operation. Was he supposed to survive it? The question landed in the room with a particular weight. Reardon met her eyes. The exposure levels in the water system were not consistent with what a person handling the introduction would have calculated as a safe personal threshold, he said carefully. If Ulm was told the compound's behavior parameters, he would have known he was at risk. If he wasn't told, someone used him, she said. That's the current assessment. She thought about Garrett Ulm lying in Bay 4 with his veins darkening and no ID on him, no wallet, no phone. A name tag torn off a maintenance uniform. Someone had stripped his identification before he came in, which meant someone had prepared for the possibility that he'd be found. They'd wanted him to be a blank, a contamination source with no traceable origin. She looked at her coffee cup. How is he? She asked. Critical, but stable. Vascular progression has stopped. He's not going to lose the arm. Reardon paused. He'll likely be a significant witness. His attorney is already in contact with the federal prosecutor. He had an attorney that fast? He had an attorney before he was even identified, Reardon said. Someone retained counsel for him using a Drexel Meridian operating account on the same morning he was admitted. A beat. The account was supposed to be dormant. It wasn't. She thought about that. Someone in the operation had protected Ulm, had arranged legal representation while he was unconscious and unidentified, which meant they'd known he was in the hospital before anyone else did, which meant they'd been watching. Or they'd known the operation had failed, and Ulm was in the wind. The email I received, she said. The anonymous sender, the procurement document. Reardon looked at her. Yes. It was someone protecting Ulm. Someone inside Drexel Meridian who wanted the operation exposed before the buyers took delivery, because once delivery happened, Ulm's usefulness was at an end, Reardon said, and the operation would close the loose ends. He put a folder on the table between them. The email originated from a device registered to a Drexel Meridian employee, Petra Voss. Research coordinator, 37 years old, hired 14 months ago. She was the third person we were looking for when we entered the facility. He opened the folder. She wasn't there because she'd walked into the Ravenport field office of the FBI at 7:15 this morning and requested protective custody. Madison looked at the photograph in the folder, a woman with careful eyes and the tight expression of someone who'd been calculating risk for long enough that it showed in the set of her face. She's the one who sent me the document, Madison said. She confirms it. She'd been looking for a clinical contact, someone who would recognize what V7 was and escalate it immediately. She'd been monitoring the hospital system for an intake that matched V7 presentation. When Ulm came in, he stopped. She found your name in the staff directory, said she chose you because you were the only nursing staff member who'd completed military medical training. That landed somewhere specific. A woman she'd never met, in a position she couldn't imagine, trying to collapse a bioweapons operation from inside it, had gone looking for someone she'd never met and picked her name off a list. What does she want? Madison asked. Cooperation with the investigation in exchange for a reduced charge agreement. She has documentation of the full operation, research, sales, the buyer network, communications between Graves and the Drexel Meridian principals. He closed the folder. She has enough to dismantle the entire thing. Then it's done. Almost. He looked at her. The first delivery tranche, the one scheduled for this week. We've identified the likely destination, and we have international partners moving on it. But the buyer hasn't been located yet. We have a 48-hour window before they go to ground. He paused. And we have a problem with the evidence chain. She waited. The Phase 2 outcomes report from Graves's office, Reardon said. The search was conducted under an emergency authorization. Graves's attorney is already filing a challenge on the authorization scope. He said it with the flat tone of someone who found the legality of this profoundly annoying and entirely unsurprising. The synthesis documentation from the facility is solid. Voss's testimony is solid. But the report from the office, if it gets challenged successfully, it drops the Graves connection to the original V7 research, she said. It weakens it significantly, not fatally, given everything else, but enough to matter for the conviction scope. He looked at her steadily. However, there's a separate chain of documentation that isn't subject to the same challenge. She understood where this was going before he said it. Your records, he said, from tonight. Your intake documentation, the notes you made before you were suspended, the manual log entry you made in Bay 4 before Graves ordered you out of the room. They established that you identified the compound before any federal involvement. They established Graves's response, removing you, dismissing the identification, ordering the wrong protocol. That sequence, documented in your handwriting with timestamps, establishes both his knowledge and his active interference. His attorney will argue I'm a self-interested party. His attorney will argue a lot of things. Reardon looked almost neutral. Your documentation will be supported by Agent Vane's witness account, Dominic Reyes's time-stamped independent records, Karen Solis's account of the Isolation Bay call, and the treatment record showing that the anaphylaxis protocol was run on a V7 patient for 3 hours before the protocol switch. He paused. The attorney can argue. It won't help. She looked at the table for a moment. The hospital board, she said. How many of them knew about the Drexel Meridian contract? That's under investigation. Graves held the relevant board seat, but the contract required 2 additional signatures. He let that sit there. While, she said, the HR administrator who had brought the pre-filled suspension form to the break room at 3 a.m, who had been in every administrative conversation, who had coordinated the suspension with the kind of precision that required advanced preparation. Robert Weil signed the contract as administrative officer, Reardon said. His cooperation with the investigation is, he paused, limited. His attorney told him to stop talking. This morning, yes. She sat with the full picture for a moment. Graves and Weil, the board seat, the contract, the Water Authority access, the 3 years of testing on civilian populations, 13 deaths before Ravenport, the synthesis facility 12 miles away, 4 buyers, a delivery scheduled for this week, and a suspended nurse who'd been escorted out of an emergency response meeting less than 12 hours ago. The patients, she said. What's the current count? 417 confirmed exposures, 89 presenting as moderate to severe, 12 in critical condition. He paused. No fatalities in Ravenport. She thought about that. 417 people who turned on their taps or made coffee or poured a glass of water the previous morning and had no way of knowing what was in it. 12 who were in critical condition right now in hospital beds. 0 who had died. The protocol sheet, Reardon said, the one you wrote at 4 a.m, It's been used on every patient at the Civic Center overflow and the secondary intake site that went active at 7 a.m. The outcomes data from those sites compared to the initial Ironcrest presentations before the protocol change. He stopped. You cut the critical progression rate significantly. She didn't say anything. That's not a small thing, he said. I know. She looked at her coffee cup. I need to get back to my patients. The shift turned over at 2 p.m., which was when the day staff came in and found a department that looked like it had been through something, and had. The trauma bays had been cycled through, cleaned, restocked. The census was dropping as patients stabilized or were transferred to the overflow facility. The acute phase of the crisis was not over, but the edge of it had been reached, the point where the situation stopped expanding and started being managed. Madison handed off to the day charge nurse, a woman named Tova, who asked only the most essential questions and received the most essential answers, and then Madison stood in the corridor for a moment and let the shift end. She was walking toward the exit when she passed the administrative corridor. Graves's office was still sealed, yellow tape across the door, evidence markers, a BCD seal with a case number on it. The nameplate on the door still read, Dr. Leonard Graves, Chief Physician. Someone was going to have to take that down eventually. Not today. Weil's office, 2 doors down, was also sealed. She hadn't known about Weil's signature on the contract until 40 minutes ago, but in retrospect it explained the pre-filled suspension form, the 3 a.m. timing, the coordinated precision of an administrative action that had been prepared before the emergency response meeting ended. Graves had called it while he was still in the meeting, and Weil had prepared the paperwork before he walked out. She kept walking. In the main lobby, 2 of Reardon's team members were stationed near the entrance, which would probably continue for a while. The waiting area had been cleared of the non-critical walk-in exposures, most of them transferred or discharged. The chairs were empty except for one, a man in his 60s, Hispanic, who was sitting with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the middle distance. She almost walked past him, then she didn't. She sat down in the chair one over from his. Are you waiting for someone? He looked at her. My wife, she came in early this morning. He said it with the measured calm of someone who'd been waiting long enough, that the acute panic had settled into something steadier and harder. They told me she was stable 3 hours ago. No one has told me anything since. What's her name? He told her. Madison recognized it. The woman from the lobby, the dress slacks, the mismatched shoes, the one she'd gotten into a bay at 6 in the morning with early stage presentation. Come with me, she said. She walked him to the nursing station, found the chart, confirmed the status. Stable, moved to the medical floor at 10 a.m. Vitals improving, expected to be extubated by evening if the trend continued. She relayed all of it to him in clear, simple language, not the language of someone reading a chart, but the language of someone speaking to a person. He looked at her for a moment after she finished. She said someone helped her when she first came in, he said. A nurse. She didn't catch the name. He paused. She said the nurse held her arm and said she knew what was happening. Lots of nurses on tonight, Madison said. He nodded slowly. Then, thank you. She gave him directions to the medical floor and left him to find his wife. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. She stood in the ambulance bay for a moment, just stood there in the gray afternoon light and breathed. The kind of breathing that wasn't particularly emotional or particularly intentional, just the basic act of being outside a building and noticing the air. Her phone buzzed. Reardon. Federal briefing at 1800 hours, Civic Center. You're listed as a consultant, transportation provided if needed. She typed back, I'll get myself there. She was halfway to her car when the phone buzzed again. Different number, one she recognized, one she'd seen on the display twice before without answering because the timing was wrong. It was the number for Ironcrest Hospital's chief administrative officer. She answered, Nurse Hale. The voice was careful in the way of someone who had recently been in a room with federal officials and had revised their understanding of several things. This is Patricia Drummond. I'm the chief administrative officer. I'd like... A pause. I think it would be appropriate for us to speak today, when you have time, about my suspension. Among other things, yes. Madison looked at the parking lot. The mobile command unit was still there. 2 BCD vehicles, a Ravenport Police Department unit that hadn't been there this morning. The architecture of a federal operation mid-execution. I can come in at 5, she said. That would be... Another pause. That would be very good. Thank you. She ended the call. She sat in her car for 90 seconds before starting it, stared at the steering wheel. She was tired in a way that went beyond sleep deprivation. The particular fatigue of having been right when it cost something, of having held a position under pressure for 8 hours while people who outranked her told her she was wrong, of having had to watch a man nearly die from the wrong treatment because she'd been removed from the room. She was not happy in the way that movies made people look happy when the situation turned. She was just tired and clear and ready for the next thing. She started the car. She was 2 blocks from the hospital when the alert came through on the federal notification app that Reardon had installed on her phone during the morning. She pulled over to read it. It was a preliminary field report from the International Partner Agency handling the first delivery tranche intercept. She read it twice, making sure she understood it correctly. The destination facility had been raided. The delivery had not yet occurred. What investigators found at the location was consistent with a buyer operation. Infrastructure, receiving documentation, personnel with the profile of a procurement network, and a secondary document cache that the field team was describing, in careful federal language, as potentially expanding the scope of the investigation significantly. She scrolled down. The secondary documents referenced not 4 buyers, but 7. 3 additional purchase agreements that hadn't been in the Drexel Meridian facility records. Agreements that predated the Ravenport operation by 18 months, which meant they predated Drexel Meridian's registration as a company, which meant the network had existed before the front company had, which meant Graves hadn't built Drexel Meridian. He'd been recruited into something that already existed. Her phone rang immediately. Reardon. She picked up. You saw the alert, he said. Just now. The briefing at 6 is going to be different than what I told you it was going to be, he said. We need your analysis on the expanded document set. The original V7 research credentials, the compound identification, the clinical timeline, all of it becomes more relevant, not less, with 7 buyers and an 18-month prior network. Graves wasn't the architect, she said. No. A pause. He was the access point, the research credentials, the hospital cover, the water authority connection. He provided the civilian infrastructure for something that was already operational. She looked out her windshield at the street. Ordinary afternoon in Ravenport. Traffic, a woman pushing a stroller, a delivery truck double parked outside a restaurant. The surface of a city that had no idea how close it had come. Who built the network? She asked. Reardon was quiet for 3 seconds. That's what the briefing is about. She started the car again. She had 3 hours before the briefing. She drove home, showered, ate something she couldn't afterward remember, changed into clean clothes, and sat for a moment at her kitchen table with her hands around a cup of coffee that went cold while she was thinking. Somewhere in a federal holding facility, Leonard Graves was sitting across from lawyers, understanding for the first time that the thing he'd been part of was larger than he'd apparently known. Somewhere in a hospital bed, Garrett Olm's attorney was preparing for cooperation negotiations. Somewhere in federal protective custody, Petra Voss was going through everything she knew with investigators who were moving as fast as federal investigators moved, which was faster than it looked and slower than the situation wanted. And somewhere, 7 buyers who had thought they were purchasing a weapon had just found out that the operation they'd contracted with had been exposed. She thought about what people did when they found out a transaction had been compromised, when they realized the thing they'd paid for wasn't coming, and the people who could identify them were now in federal hands. She thought about Petra Voss in protective custody. She picked up her phone and called Reardon's number. He answered on the first ring. Voss, she said. Where is she? A pause. 1 second too long. Reardon. Where is she right now? She was transferred to a secondary holding facility at 1300 hours for security reasons. His voice was careful. Standard protocol for high-value cooperative witnesses when... Who authorized the transfer? Silence. Who authorized it? She said again. Because if there are 7 buyers instead of 4, and the network is 18 months older than Drexel Meridian, then someone in that network has had 18 months to develop federal contacts. Someone who would know that Voss is the most dangerous witness you have. The silence on Reardon's end was not the silence of someone who didn't understand what she was saying. It was the silence of someone who had understood it approximately 30 seconds before she called, and was already moving on it. "I'll call you back," he said. "Don't call me back," she said. "Tell me right now if she's safe." Another pause. And when Reardon spoke again, his voice had the quality she'd heard twice before in the past 12 hours. The quality of someone absorbing information that required immediate action and no visible panic. "We're verifying her location now," he said. Which was not the same as saying she was safe. She was already in her car. Reardon was still on the line, and she could hear the controlled urgency on his end. Voices in the background, someone reading off an address. The particular acoustic texture of a command operation shifting gears mid-execution. She pulled out of her parking spot and started driving without knowing exactly where she was going yet, because the where depended on information that hadn't come through. "The secondary facility?" she said. "Give me the address." "Madison, you said you need my analysis at the briefing. You need Voss alive for the briefing. Give me the address." A pause, then he read it. She had it memorized before he finished the second line. It was a federal contractor facility on the north side of the city, one of those nondescript office buildings that housed government-adjacent operations, the kind that had unmarked vehicles in the lot and badge readers on every interior door and could be any kind of bureaucratic function from the outside. She'd driven past it once without knowing what it was, 14 minutes from where she sat. She drove. Reardon stayed on the line without speaking, which meant he was managing his own situation and keeping the channel open simultaneously. She could hear when his team confirmed something, a shift in the background noise, a clipped exchange, but he didn't relay it to her. At the 12-minute mark, he said, "We have a problem with the transfer authorization." Define problem. The transfer order was signed by a senior BCD official at the main office. That official has been unreachable since 11 a.m. A pause. His badge was used to access the credentials database at 11:43. He's not in the building. She processed that while navigating a yellow light. A senior BCD official with database access, unreachable, badge used after he'd apparently left. The network was 18 months old. 18 months was long enough to identify the right person, build the right relationship, establish the right access. "Someone turned him," she said. "Or recruited him from the start," Reardon said. "We don't know yet." "Does Voss know she's been moved?" "She was told it was a security upgrade. So she doesn't know she's in danger." "We don't know what she knows." She pulled into the contractor facility lot at 14 minutes exactly. There were 3 vehicles parked near the main entrance that didn't fit the standard profile. Too clean, too similar. The kind of identical anonymous sedans that suggested either a government motor pool or someone trying to look like one. She parked 30 feet away and stayed in her car. "I'm at the facility," she said. "Do not go inside," Reardon said, flat and unambiguous. "I have a team 4 minutes out. Do not go inside, Madison." "I'm not going inside." She looked at the 3 vehicles. Looked at the main entrance. Glass doors, badge reader, a reception desk visible through the glass with no one visibly behind it. The lobby is unmanned. "What?" "The reception desk. It's empty." At 3 in the afternoon on a weekday. She watched the entrance. Either they evacuated non-essential personnel or the facility wasn't fully notified of the transfer, which means the transfer wasn't processed through normal channels. Reardon said something to someone on his end that she couldn't fully hear. She kept watching the entrance. At 2 minutes and 40 seconds, the glass door opened. Not a tactical exit. Not a run. A woman walking out with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone trying not to draw attention. Early 30s, dark jacket, the careful eyes from the photograph in Reardon's folder. Petra Voss. Alone, no escort, moving toward the parking lot with the particular directional focus of someone who knew exactly where she was going and was very committed to getting there without being stopped. She was heading for the 3 clean vehicles. Madison got out of her car. She didn't run. Running attracted attention in a way that walking didn't, and she needed 4 more seconds before anyone looking out a window would clock that something was happening. She moved at the pace of a person who had somewhere to be and was walking to their car, angling to intercept Voss's path at a point roughly 15 feet from the anonymous sedans. Voss saw her at 10 feet. Stopped. They looked at each other for a half second. "Federal Protective is not coming," Voss said. Her accent was faint, Eastern European somewhere underneath the English. "The people inside told me they had a security upgrade. They wanted me to get in a vehicle. I know. You're not BCD. No, Madison said. I'm the nurse. Something crossed Voss's face. Recognition, then something more complicated. You got my email. I got your email. Madison glanced at the glass entrance behind her. I need you to come with me right now and not get in any of those cars. Voss looked at the sedans, back at Madison. She was doing the math that people did when they were in her position, calculating risk across limited options with incomplete information. Madison knew that calculation. She'd made it herself in different rooms, different countries. My car is over there, Madison said. Reardon's team is 3 minutes out. We wait in my car until they arrive. 3 seconds. Then Voss moved toward her and Madison moved with her, and they walked across the parking lot at the pace of people going nowhere in particular, and got into Madison's car, and Madison locked the doors and kept her eyes on the building entrance. 2 minutes and 17 seconds later, 3 BCD vehicles pulled into the lot at speed. The team went through the facility entrance. What they found inside, Reardon told her afterward, was 2 individuals who had been tasked by the compromised official to complete the transfer to a location that did not appear in any federal database. Both were now in custody. Neither had the professional profile of law enforcement. They were contractors, the private kind, the kind that existed in the gap between official operations and the things official operations couldn't officially do. Voss was taken into genuine protective custody at 4:12 p.m. Before she went, she looked at Madison through the car window for a moment. I read your military record, she said, what I could find of it, which wasn't much. She paused. I thought you'd believe me. That's why I chose you. Did you think I'd identify the compound? Voss considered it. I hoped. I wasn't certain. She looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up. Garrett. He didn't know what the full exposure level would do to him. They told him the safety threshold was higher than it was. I found out the night before and She stopped. I wasn't fast enough. I should have moved sooner. Madison looked at her. The weight of that, the specific weight of knowing something too late and having to carry what came after, was not abstract to her. He's alive, she said. He's cooperating. Whatever he did, he'll have a chance to account for it. Voss nodded once. Then she got out of the car and went with Reardon's team, and Madison sat in the parking lot for a moment and breathed. The 6 p.m. briefing happened in a conference room at the Civic Center that had been converted from overflow intake to federal operations space with the efficiency of an organization that had done this kind of conversion before. The patient cots were gone. In their place, tables, screens, personnel from BCD, FBI, the Department of Justice, and 2 individuals from an agency that wasn't identified by name in the room, but whose presence Reardon had mentioned as necessary for the international buyer network element of the case. There were 16 people in the room when Madison walked in. She was the only one not in federal employment. Reardon had not told her to dress up or dress down or prepare a formal presentation. He told her to come and be ready to talk about the clinical timeline and the compound identification. She'd worn clean clothes and brought a notepad that she didn't end up needing. The briefing ran for 2 hours and 40 minutes. The picture that assembled across those 2 hours and 40 minutes was larger and uglier than anything the individual pieces had suggested. The network predating Drexel Meridian had operated for 3 years before Graves was recruited, or recruited himself. The distinction was still being established, and had already successfully brokered one smaller transaction involving a different compound. The 7 buyers represented 4 countries. The 18 months of V7 credential access Graves had been used to build a verification package, a proof that the modified compound Drexel Meridian was selling was derived from and superior to documented military research, which made it more valuable to buyers who needed credibility behind the product. He'd sold the credibility of classified military work to people who wanted to use it for the opposite of what it had been developed for. That was the core of it. Everything else was operational detail. The 2 prior test events, the rural communities where 13 people had died attributed to agricultural contamination, were confirmed as Drexel Meridian test runs. The outcomes data from those events had been incorporated into the buyer verification package. 13 people. 13 deaths that had been filed as accident, explained to their families as industrial misfortune. grieved by communities that never knew what had actually happened to them. Madison sat in that room and listened to this assembled into a coherent picture and felt something that she didn't have an exact word for. Not anger, exactly, though there was anger. Something colder and more settled. The particular feeling of looking at a thing clearly, all the way through, without flinching from what it was. When it was her turn to speak, she spoke for 22 minutes. Clinical timeline from first intake at 11:47 p.m. through the identification, the confrontation with Graves, the suspension, the re-entry, the protocol development, the treatment outcomes. She was specific and factual and did not dramatize. She referenced her documentation by timestamp. She answered questions from the DOJ attorney about the basis for her identification with the same clarity she'd used to answer questions in the trauma bay. At one point, the unnamed agency representative, a woman in her 50s who had not spoken for the first hour and 40 minutes, asked, "When you identified the compound, what was your certainty level at that moment?" 70%, Madison said, based on pattern recognition from prior exposure to V7 field documentation. The certainty increased to 95% when the second patient presented with an identical pattern within the same intake window. But at the initial identification, 70%. Yes. And you acted on a 70% certainty. I acted on what the patient's condition required, Madison said. A 30% chance I was wrong about the compound identity didn't change what I was seeing in his arm. The presentation required isolation, regardless of what was causing it. The downside of being wrong was an unnecessary isolation bay. The downside of waiting for certainty was a man dying from a treatable condition. The woman looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote something on her notepad and didn't ask further questions. After the briefing, Reardon walked her out. They stood in the corridor outside the conference room. The Civic Center was quieter than it had been 8 hours ago. The last of the acute intake patients had been transferred or discharged. The overnight monitoring staff had taken over. The crisis edge had definitively passed. The compromised official, Madison said, the one who signed the transfer order. In custody as of 2 hours ago. He's cooperating. How far does it go inside BCD? We're auditing, Mutt. He said it with the brevity of someone who didn't enjoy the implications of what he was saying. We don't believe it goes far. One point of access, managed carefully, for the specific purpose of this operation. He paused. That doesn't make it less serious. No, she agreed. It doesn't. He looked at her for a moment. You should know. The documentation you produced tonight, the protocol sheet, the clinical timeline, your intake records, they're going to be central to multiple prosecutions. The federal prosecutor's office has already requested them. I know. And your identification of Voss in the parking lot, I happened to be in the right place, she said. You drove 14 minutes because you thought she was in danger, he said. That's not the same thing. She looked at him. Reardon was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and he was not a man who offered comfort as a diplomatic gesture. She'd understood that about him within the first 30 minutes of knowing him. Thank you, she said, for taking me seriously this morning. He seemed briefly unsure how to receive that. You made it easy, he said. You were right about everything. Not everything, she said. I didn't see the second vehicle until too late. I should have flagged the transfer order risk earlier. You flagged it in time. Barely. He almost smiled. Almost. Get some sleep, he said. Bam. The meeting with Patricia Drummond happened the following morning, not at 5 p.m. as originally scheduled. The briefing had run long, and then Reardon had needed her for follow-up analysis on the expanded buyer documents until 9 p.m., after which she'd gone home and slept for 9 hours with her phone on silent and woken up feeling like a person again, rather than a collection of functions running on borrowed time. Patricia Drummond was a woman in her early 60s who had the careful posture of someone who'd spent her career managing institutional risk and had recently discovered that the institution she'd been protecting had done something she hadn't known about and now had to manage the consequences. She was not someone Madison had interacted with before. The CAO was several organizational layers above a staff nurse's daily reality. She had Ironcrest's legal counsel present, which was expected. What Madison hadn't expected was that Robert Weil was not present. She'd noted his absence without asking about it. She found out afterward from Karen Solis, who heard it from the hospital administrator on the floor, Weil had submitted his resignation at 8 a.m., on the advice, presumably, of his own counsel, though the federal hold on his departure meant the resignation was largely symbolic. Drummond began by saying that the hospital had been cooperating fully with the federal investigation, which Madison let sit without comment because its truth was less important than the fact that Drummond felt compelled to say it first. Then Drummond said, "The suspension of your nursing privileges on Tuesday night was conducted improperly and without legitimate cause." "Yes," Madison said, "it was." The legal counsel shifted slightly in her seat. "The hospital is prepared to fully reinstate your privileges effective immediately, with all back pay for the period of the suspension expunged from your record entirely." Drummond paused. "And the board is prepared to offer a formal apology, in writing, and if you're willing, in a statement to staff." "I'm willing," Madison said. Additionally, Drummond looked at the folder in front of her. "The board has been discussing the position of Director of Emergency Preparedness. It was an unfilled role before Tuesday. Given the events of this week and the clear gaps in our institutional response that those events exposed," she paused, "and given your demonstrated expertise in exactly the area that role is meant to address, the board would like to offer you the position." The legal counsel was watching Madison's face with the professional attention of someone waiting to gauge reaction. Madison thought about it. She thought about the role itself, what it actually meant, what building it from the ground up would require, the resistance she'd face from people inside the institution who would have preferred the events of Tuesday night to have gone differently. She thought about the patients at the Civic Center who had been treated by nurses following a protocol she'd written on a folding table in a supply closet at 4 in the morning. She thought about this man from Bay 4, Garrett Ulm, and whether the role would give her the kind of reach to build the systems that might catch something like this earlier. Not the compound specifically, but the pattern of it. She thought about Dominic Reyes and his time-stamped documentation and what kind of institution she'd want him to work in. "Yes," she said. Drummond exhaled slightly. Not dramatically, just the exhale of someone who'd prepared for a harder conversation. "There are conditions," Madison said. A small pause. "Of course. The treatment protocol I developed Tuesday night becomes the baseline for our mass casualty chemical response planning. Not a draft, not a reference document, the baseline. I want authority to revise it as evidence base develops." She held Drummond's eye. "I want a direct line to the Federal Emergency Management Liaison that doesn't go through administrative approval. I want staffing authority for emergency preparedness that isn't subject to budget committee delays. And I want the Bay 4 intake to be formally reviewed by an independent clinical panel with the findings shared with nursing staff." The legal counsel was writing. "The last one," Drummond said. "The independent review was... What's the purpose?" "The purpose," Madison said, "is that a physician ordered the wrong treatment for a patient for 3 hours because a nurse was removed from the room for correctly identifying the condition. The institution should understand that clearly, formally, as a matter of clinical record. Not for legal reasons, for learning reasons." Drummond was quiet for a moment. "All of it," she said. "Agreed." The press briefing was held 4 days later at City Hall. Madison had been asked by Reardon whether she was willing to be present. Not as a speaker initially. The federal officials would handle the public statement, but present, identifiable, on record as the clinical lead who had managed the initial identification and treatment. She said yes. The room was full. Local press, regional affiliates, 2 national outlets that had picked up the story when the federal charges were announced the previous day. The charges were extensive. Leonard Graves had been indicted on 9 counts, including conspiracy to develop and sell biological weapons, willful exposure of civilian populations to a hazardous substance, obstruction of a federal investigation, and 3 counts related to the prior test events in the rural communities. The assistant U.S. attorney who read the charges into the record did so without inflection, the way you read something that was serious enough that additional emphasis would have been obscene. Robert Weil faced 4 counts. The Drexel Meridian principals, 3 individuals, 2 of whom were in federal custody and 1 of whom was subject to an international arrest warrant, faced charges that the federal prosecutor described as among the most serious ever filed in this jurisdiction. The compromised BCD official, a man named Douglas Farr, who had held his position for 11 years, faced 2 counts of conspiracy and 1 of obstruction. His cooperation had been partial and was continuing to be negotiated. He would not receive leniency commensurate with what he seemed to believe he'd earned. Petra Voss had entered a cooperation agreement. The specific terms were not public. Madison knew from Reardon that they were structured to reflect the reality of Voss's situation, that she had been recruited under circumstances that involved significant personal danger, that she had eventually acted to end the operation at considerable personal risk, and that without her the case would have been both harder to build and slower to reach the scale of exposure it had achieved. The charges she faced were reduced accordingly. Not eliminated. Reduced. Garrett Olm's cooperation agreement was being finalized. He remained hospitalized, improving, with the vascular presentation in his arm showing continued reversal under the treatment protocol. His attorney had described him, in a statement, as a man who had been deceived about the nature of the operation and the danger it posed. That was partially true. The parts that were not true would be accounted for through the legal process. 13 families in 2 rural communities were being contacted by federal victim services. That process was going to take a long time and was not going to be easy, and would not, Madison thought, produce anything that felt like justice to anyone who had loved those 13 people. But it would produce the truth, which was the only thing the legal system could actually deliver, and which was, despite everything, not nothing. At the briefing, Reardon spoke first. He gave a precise, factual account of the operation from the federal side. The activation of BCD, the facility discovery, the arrests, the international coordination. He did not editorialize. He did not use the word hero. He named the clinical response that had happened at Ironcrest Regional and at the Civic Center Overflow Facility, and attributed the treatment outcomes to the protocol developed on-site during the initial response. Then the assistant U.S. attorney spoke. Then the mayor of Ravenport spoke, which was the least informative segment of the briefing but was politically necessary, and Madison understood that. Then Reardon stepped back to the microphone and said, "I'd like to introduce the clinical lead for the Ravenport Emergency Response, Nurse Madison Hale." She walked to the microphone. She had not prepared remarks. She thought about preparing remarks and decided against it, because prepared remarks required her to predict what she'd want to say in a room like this, and she'd been wrong about enough things in the past week that she'd decided to trust the moment more than her predictions of it. She looked at the room. Cameras, faces. People who had covered water contamination stories, and people who had covered federal prosecutions, and people who had covered hospital scandals, all of them recalibrating what kind of story this was in real time. "I identified the compound at 11:47 p.m. on Tuesday," she said. "I was suspended from the hospital approximately 3 hours later for doing so. The compound continued affecting people in this city for several hours after my suspension, while I was not permitted to practice." She paused. 417 people were exposed. There are no fatalities in Ravenport. The treatment protocol that achieved those outcomes was written in a supply closet at 4 in the morning, while the physician who had ordered my suspension was running an emergency response meeting that did not include me. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "I am not telling you this to relitigate Tuesday night. I'm telling you this because the next time something like this happens, and there will be a next time, somewhere, with something, the person who identifies it first may be the person with the least institutional authority in the room. And whether they are listened to or removed from the room will determine whether people live or die." The room was quiet. "I was a combat medic before I was a hospital nurse," she said. "I have worked in environments where the hierarchy of authority and the hierarchy of knowledge do not always align. That gap is survivable in a bureaucracy. In a mass casualty event, it is not." She looked at the cameras without flinching. "Respect should come before rank." She stepped back from the microphone. The room did not erupt. It absorbed. There was a moment of the particular stillness that happens when something true has been said in a public space, and the people present are processing what it means for them specifically, what it means for their reporting, their institution, their self-understanding. Then the questions started, and she answered them for 40 minutes without evasion and without performance. And when she was done, she walked off the stage, and Dominic was standing in the back of the room, and he looked like he'd been punched in the chest by something he was glad had hit him. "That was," he started. "Don't," she said. He closed his mouth. Then, "Karen's crying. Karen cries at everything." She says she only cries at things that deserve it. Madison looked at him for a moment. She was tired still. Not the acute exhaustion of Tuesday night, but the deeper tiredness of several days of sustained intensity that wanted to become rest. Her neck still hurt from the break room table. "Are you going to be okay here?" she said. He looked at her. "At the hospital?" "In this work. In general." She wasn't asking to be kind. She was asking because she wanted to know. It gets harder to ignore things once you've seen what happens when you don't ignore them. He thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, which she appreciated. "Yes," he said. "I think so." "Good." The weeks that followed were not triumphant in any cinematic sense. They were complicated and bureaucratic and sometimes frustrating in the way that institutional change was always frustrating, slower than the urgency that had created the need for it, attended by people who wanted to be associated with the outcome without revisiting the process that had made the outcome necessary. The Director of Emergency Preparedness position was formally created, and Madison was formally appointed to it in a staff meeting that Drummond convened with the kind of solemnity appropriate to an acknowledgement that the institution had nearly failed catastrophically and had been saved by someone it had tried to remove. Madison sat in that meeting and accepted the position and did not make a speech, because the position itself was the speech. The existence of it, on her terms, in this building, was the thing that needed to be said. She built it from the ground up. The emergency response protocol was the first thing, a comprehensive document, not the 2-page triage sheet she'd written under pressure, but a full institutional protocol covering chemical and biological mass casualty events with clear identification pathways, escalation authorities, and treatment guidelines that did not require a suspended nurse to reconstruct from classified memory in the middle of the night. She worked on it with input from Reardon's medical officer, from the CDC liaisons who had been on site during the response, from the Civic Center triage nurses who had used the original sheet under pressure and had specific granular feedback about what had worked and what had needed clarification. It took 6 weeks. It was not perfect. She knew it wasn't perfect because no protocol written in advance can account for every variable in a real event. What it was better. Better than what had existed before. Better than what the event had required people to improvise. Better than an institution that had no formal guidance whatsoever on what to do if the person who understood the threat had the wrong job title. She also started a weekly case review session for nursing staff. Not mandatory, not formal, not attached to any disciplinary or performance evaluation process. Just an hour on Thursday mornings where anyone who wanted to could come and talk about a patient situation where the clinical picture had been unclear, or where they'd had a concern they hadn't been sure how to raise, or where something had gone differently than expected, and they wanted to understand why. The first week, 4 people came. The second week, 9. By the 6th week, the room was regularly at capacity, and she'd had to move it to a larger space. Dominic came every week. He was going to be good at this. She could see it clearly now, the way you could see a thing clearly when the pressure had stripped away everything that wasn't essential. Karen Solis came most weeks and brought decent coffee, which elevated the whole enterprise. The federal prosecutions moved at the pace federal prosecutions moved, which was not fast but was thorough. The preliminary hearings for Graves generated the kind of press coverage that required no additional comment. The charges, the evidence, the scope of what had been operating behind the cover of a hospital administrative position were sufficiently documented that the reporting spoke entirely for itself. Leonard Graves had retained a legal team that was very expensive and very skilled, and not sufficiently skilled to make the evidence disappear. At the preliminary hearing, when the assistant U.S. attorney presented the Phase 2 outcomes report, the Drexel Meridian synthesis documentation, Petrovos's testimony, Garrett Olm's cooperation statement, and the independent clinical panel's findings from the Bay 4 review, there was a specific moment. She read about it afterward in the court reporting. She wasn't there. When Graves's lead attorney had asked for a brief recess and the court had granted it, Graves had entered a partial guilty plea on 4 of the 9 counts 8 weeks after his arrest, on the advice of his legal team. The plea negotiation collapsed on the remaining 5 counts, and those went to trial. The trial lasted 11 days. The jury deliberated for less than 2. Guilty on all remaining counts. The sentencing hearing was 3 months after the verdict. Madison did not attend. She was in the middle of a Thursday case review session when it happened. She found out the result from a text from Reardon. Graves, 34 years federal, no parole eligibility for 20, while 9 years. Drexel principals, life for the 2 in custody, warrant active for 3rd. She read it during a break in the session, put her phone in her pocket, went back into the room. Dominic caught the expression on her face when she returned. Good news? He said quietly. Appropriate news, she said. She thought about those 13 people, the ones who had died in communities that never knew why. She thought about Garrett Ulm in a hospital bed, and Petra Voss in protective custody, and the families of 417 people who had turned on their taps one ordinary morning and gotten something that was not ordinary. She thought about what 34 years meant for a man who had spent 20 years building a careful, credentialed life as cover for something that killed people for the sake of a product verification. Appropriate. That was the word she had for it. The international buyer prosecutions were ongoing at the time of the sentencing and would be for some time. One buyer had been taken into custody by an allied agency. 2 were under active international warrant. The 4th had apparently understood the operation was compromised within hours of the federal action and had moved in ways that were currently the subject of ongoing intelligence work that Reardon was not at liberty to discuss with her. That one bothered her. She was honest with herself about that. Not knowing was difficult. But the alternative, doing this work only when every thread could be tied off perfectly, would have meant not doing it at all. Some threads took longer, some took years. She could live with that. She had before. 5 months after the Tuesday night that started all of it, there was a federal ceremony, not a spectacle. Reardon had been clear that BCD didn't do spectacle, and that suited Madison fine. A citation ceremony, closed attendance, in a federal conference room that was neither ceremonial nor particularly comfortable. Folding chairs, the particular fluorescent lighting of a government building that hadn't been renovated recently, coffee that was slightly better than the hospital break room and slightly worse than Thursday morning case review. Reardon presented her with the Bioterror Containment Division's Civilian Service Commendation. He read the citation language, which was formal and specific, and credited her with the initial compound identification, the protocol development, the critical treatment guidance, and what he called demonstrating decisive clinical judgment under conditions of significant institutional and personal adversity. She stood and received the commendation in front of 12 people, 6 of whom she knew and 6 of whom she did not. Priya, the analyst from the Mobile Command Unit, was there. The CDC liaison who had taken her calls from the Civic Center was there. Agent Vane, who had been in the trauma bay at the beginning of all of it, was there and looked like a man who had thought carefully about what he'd said and not said that night and had arrived at a complicated understanding of it. There was also a service commendation for Petra Voss, which was presented in absentia. Voss was currently in a relocation program. Madison didn't know where. She suspected she was never going to find out. After the ceremony, Reardon walked her to her car. The job offer stands, he said. It has since about 48 hours in. What job offer? BCD has a civilian medical advisory position. We don't fill it often. When we do, we need someone who can translate between clinical reality and federal response. He said it without pressure, which she thought was probably calculated, but was still the right approach. It doesn't require you to leave Ironcrest. It's a consulting role. She thought about it. Send me the parameters, she said. Already did. 3 weeks ago. She looked at him. I haven't checked that email. I know. I've been patient. He said it without irony. She got into her car. Through the windshield, she looked at the ordinary gray sky of a Tuesday afternoon in Ravenport, 5 months and 1 week after another Tuesday that had started in a trauma bay at midnight and ended somewhere she hadn't predicted. She thought about what it meant to know something that no one in the room believed. She thought about what it cost to say it anyway. She thought about the particular loneliness of being right too early before the evidence has assembled itself into something that other people can see, and the particular strange aftermath of being vindicated, which was never quite what you expected, which came with its own weight. She had not been thanked that Tuesday night. She had been suspended. She had signed a form that removed her from a building where people were dying from a thing she could identify and treat, and she had walked toward the exit, and then she had turned around because the situation required it, and there was no one else. That was the part no commendation could fully capture. Not the expertise, not the protocol, not the compound identification. The turning around. The decision that happened in the 3 seconds between the intercom announcement and the sight of military vehicles in the rain. The choice to go back into a building that had just formally thrown her out, because the choice that served her own dignity and the choice that served the patients in those beds were not the same choice. And she had known, without deliberating, which one mattered more. She would make that choice again. She knew that about herself now with a clarity that was not pride. Pride was too narrow for what she felt, too self-congratulatory. It was more like knowledge, the simple settled knowledge of who she was under pressure. She started the car. She drove back to Ironcrest. The parking lot where the mobile command unit had sat was ordinary again. Staff vehicles, visitor parking, a food delivery driver checking his phone near the entrance. The ambulance bay was clear. Through the lobby windows, she could see the waiting room with its normal occupancy of people who were scared and tired and needed help and were waiting for someone who knew what to do. She parked, picked up her bag, got out. She had a Thursday case review to prepare for and a revised protocol section on cross-contamination isolation procedures to finish, and a meeting with the pharmacy director about emergency supply chain redundancy that she'd rescheduled twice and needed to stop rescheduling. She also had an email to read, apparently. She walked in through the main entrance, past the lobby, down the corridor she'd walked down 100 times, past the door that used to have Leonard Graves' name on it, and now had a laminated placeholder with the words Acting Chief Physician above a name she was still learning. She passed the door and kept walking. No one in the hallway stopped her. No one asked her to surrender her access card. No one told her she was out of scope, above her station, a problem that needed to be contained. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do, and the building around her knew it. That was not a small thing. She didn't let herself treat it as a small thing. Too many people in too many institutions had been told they didn't belong in the rooms where the decisions happened, had been handed pre-filled forms and escorted to exits, had watched the wrong choices get made by the right titles, and had carried the cost of those choices in silence. She didn't have a speech prepared for that reality. She didn't think speeches were the point. The point was showing up and knowing what you knew and saying it clearly and not stopping when someone told you to stop, and doing the work, and documenting it so it couldn't be undone, and turning around when you were halfway to the exit. That was it. That was all of it. She had learned something in the years before nursing, in the years of moving through places most people didn't go, doing things most people didn't know happened, coming back carrying knowledge that had no civilian context. She had learned that strength did not announce itself. The loudest person in a crisis was rarely the most useful one. The person who knew what to do was often the person standing quietly at the edge of the room, watching, assessing, waiting for the moment when the information they carried became necessary. That moment always came. She had learned to be ready for it and not to announce her readiness in advance. She thought sometimes about the woman in Bay 2, the mismatched shoes, the extended arm, the thin voice that night saying nothing intelligible but something that meant I'm still here. She was fully recovered now. Madison knew because the woman had come in for a follow-up and had asked at the nursing station for the nurse who'd been there that night. Madison had come out and they had shaken hands in the hallway outside the bay, both of them on the other side of something. The woman had not said thank you. She had looked at Madison for a moment and then said, I figured it out. You're the one they suspended. For about 4 hours, Madison said. The woman had looked at her with the particular expression of someone recalibrating. Then she'd said simply, Good that you came back. Yes, Madison had said. It was. She stood now at the nursing station and looked at the board. Room assignments, patient census, the status indicators that told the